Hi, welcome. This video is going to show you how to find an angle in a right triangle when you know two sides. We're going to use a trig ratio, and if you haven't done any trig at all, this is probably not the video to start with. You should go back and kind of learn about the basics of what sine is, what cosine is, and what tangent is. So let's get started. The three steps that we tend to use for most of the problems in trig are listed right there. We want to identify the reference angle, and then we label the hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent sides according to that reference angle. And then we want to choose whether we're going to use sine, cosine, or tangent. So we're going to go through a few problems just to kind of get used to these steps. For this particular topic, when we're going to go find an angle, it's a little bit unusual because usually you start trig and you learn how to find a side and you're given the angle. This is kind of flipping that around. So the buttons that we're going to use on our calculator are going to be these: inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. Okay, so we'll get to that as we go through the problems. So this first problem, we have a triangle. We're going to identify the reference angle. Well, in this case, the reference angle is the angle that we're looking for, and I encourage my students to circle it so it just kind of pops, and then you can see it really easily. I think that our brains and our eyes connect subconsciously a lot, and so actually circling that reference angle instead of trying to hold it in your head where it is, I think makes a difference. Step 2 says to label the hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent sides. I've actually made a video on how to do that, and here's how we do it. We find the right angle and go straight across. That is where our hypotenuse is. We find the reference angle and go straight across. That is where our opposite side is. And the remaining side that we haven't labeled is our adjacent side. It's next to that angle. Okay, so now what we're going to do is step 3. We're going to choose the correct trig ratio based on the information given. All right, well, if we look at the information that we have our hypotenuse given to us, which is 10, and we have our adjacent given to us, which is 4. So this mnemonic device here, SOHCAHTOA, helps you remember what the sine is, what the cosine is, and what the tangent is. And we're looking for which one of those ratios uses the hypotenuse and the adjacent. So if we look here, this has the adjacent and the hypotenuse, so we're going to be using the cosine of the angle. So again, when I teach this to my students, I encourage them to start by writing out the kind of the formula for cosine. So cosine of any angle is what? It is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So what we're going to do now is fill in everything that we know in this problem. So in the problem, we don't know what that angle is, so I'm just going to call it x. But we do know the adjacent, that is 4, and then the hypotenuse is 10. Okay, so now we are ready to kind of talk about these buttons. The way that we're going to type this in our calculator is we're going to say we want to take the inverse cosine, and we're going to do 4 divided by 10, and it will give us the angle number. Okay, so just grab a calculator, and then let's see, we want to press the correct buttons. Whoops, that would help. And then that is going to give us, let's see, whoops. $66.42, and actually the value goes on and on and on. It says 66.4218. In general, they'll usually say the nearest tenth, I would say, which is this spot. To round to the nearest tenth, we look at the number after it. I call that the boss. And if the boss is 5 or bigger, it makes this go up 1. Well, our boss is not 5 or bigger, so our answer here is going to be 66.4 degrees. And that's what our angle is. All right, let's take a look at another one. For this top triangle here, first step is we're going to identify the reference angle. Second step is we label the hypotenuse and the opposite and the adjacent. And the third step is we need to figure out which trig function is appropriate to use here. So we were given the hypotenuse of 41 and the opposite of 17. So if we go up here to our mnemonic device, which one of these uses O and H? And you can see right off the bat, it's sine. So again, what you might want to do is write out the equation for sine. The sine of an angle is the opposite over the hypotenuse. And now we plug in everything that we know from this triangle. So we don't know what the angle is. I'm going to use y this time. We do know the opposite. They gave us that as 17. And we do know the hypotenuse is 41. And again, the way that we're going to type it in our calculator is we're going to do inverse sine. And usually it's the second button and then the sine button. And then we're going to do 17, and I'm going to write out the division this time. 17 divided by 41, that's what a fraction bar is, and that will give us the answer. All right. If you're using a phone calculator, sometimes you have to do the division first. It depends, so kind of experiment a little bit. What I'm getting on my calculator is 24.49. And again, if we are asked to round to the nearest tenth, this is our 10th spot, and that makes that the boss. The 9 is bigger than, it was 5 or bigger, so that has to go up 1. So our nearest 10th answer would be 24.5 degrees. All right, for this lower triangle, what we're going to do is the same steps. Our reference angle is the one that we're looking for. Just by the way, the reference angle will never be the 90 degree. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. It is kind of marked, but that's not our reference angle. It will never be our reference angle for a right triangle trig problem. Now we're going to label our sides. This here is our hypotenuse. Opposite the reference angle is our opposite, and that means our final side is the adjacent. So for this particular problem, let's see what we have. We have a hypotenuse, and we have an adjacent. Up here, if we look at our mnemonic device, the only trig function that uses a and h is cosine. So again, we are going to say that the cosine of the angle is a over h. And then when we go to plug in our values, cosine of x, we know that the adjacent is 6 and the hypotenuse is 7. So what we're going to do in our calculator is inverse cosine, 6 divided by 7, and that will give us our value for that angle. And then let's see, that gives us 31.00. So to the nearest tenth, whoops, I said 0, so I should write it. We're going to get 31 degrees. Okay, let's look at one more. If you're feeling confident, actually 2 more. You could write down the problems, try them yourself, hit pause while you're trying them, and then come back and see if you got the right answer. All right, let's see this top one. So again, first step, reference angle. Second step, what we want to do is we want to label hypotenuse, we want to label opposite, and we want to label adjacent. And then our triangle's labeled. So what is the right trig function, the correct one to use in this problem? We have a hypotenuse of 8, and we have an opposite of 6. So hypotenuse and opposite is going to tell us to use this sign. So this time I'm not going to write out the equation. I'm going to just start it like this. We're going to do inverse sine of O over H, so 6 over 8. And then we're just going to grab our calculators and then figure out what, if we have to round, that will give us 48.59. Again, this is the nearest tenths. That's the boss, so the boss is big enough to kick that up. So our final answer for that problem is 48.6 degrees. And then our final problem, again, I would start by labeling my triangle. Reference angle is the one that we're looking for. We need to label up our triangle. There is our hypotenuse. There is our opposite. And the final side is the adjacent. Third step is we need to figure out which trig function makes sense to use in this situation. So we look at the numbers that were in the problem originally. We had 15, which is our A, and 21, which is our O. That is our TOA, or our tangent. So what we're going to do is the tangent inverse, or inverse tan, and it's O over A, so it's going to be 21 divided by 15. And then again, grab your calculator, and then we'll see what we get for an answer on that. And that gives us 54.46. If we're going to round to the nearest tenth, that's that spot. Our boss, once again, is big enough to knock that tenths up. So our final answer for this problem is 54.5 degrees. All right, I hope that this has helped. Again, it's kind of a straightforward process, especially if you've had a little bit of previous trig as far as finding sides and that sort of thing. I hope this helped.